אז שרלוט גרמן, בעלת תואר ראשון בלימודי שפות ותרבות מאוניברסיטת אוטרחט, ותואר שני בספרות צרפתית מאוניברסיטת תל אביב, וההתמחות שלה היא בתרגום והתאמה של ספרות למדיה הפופולרית, כמו למשל קומיקס, כמו למשל סרטים.
אז אני בארץ מ-2010, ועשיתי כמו שאמרה התואר שני פה, ואז נגעתי בתיאוריה שאני הולכת לדבר עליהם. I will do it in English though, because I'm already a bit nervous speaking in front of an audience, but speaking in another language and your mother language is challenging, and also English is actually not my mother language. Mother tongue is French and Dutch. So today I will speak of the intersemiotic translation of the diaries of Anne Frank. When I came across 10 years ago the theory about the intersemiotic translation, I was immediately convinced that it was a really interesting field to be doing research about. The theory comes originally from Roman Jakobson, the Russian-American linguist that distinguishes three types of translation: intralingual, within a language, generally over a different period of time, so when a book has been republished, different versions according to the norms of that time. Intercultural translation, which is the common form of translation as we know it between languages, and intersemiotic translation is from a different sign world, from one sign world to another different sign world. Okay. So, the diaries of Anne Frank have actually been going, I don't think I need to explain a lot about the diaries, I suppose everyone knows, it will save me some time also. So, in the Netherlands it has been published several times. It has gone through the three processes that I just mentioned, also obviously translated to many different languages worldwide. And there's also been already adaptations or intersemiotic translations, as I will call them here, to theater, to the movie and comics already. But what is new is this diary. This diary appeared in 2017 in Hebrew, and the makers of the illustrators are Avi Folman and David Politsky. Avi Folman is known for a very famous movie, Walter Bashir. And they made the comic book. A few weeks after it appeared, a really good friend of mine gave it to me as a birthday present, and I read it, and I was convinced that this is actually a really interesting topic. What else is important about this diary is that it has been officially endorsed by the Anne Frank Fund in Basel, in Switzerland, which is the foundation founded by Otto Frank, the father of Anne Frank. And yeah. Okay, a few remarks before I start. So I have a Dutch source text, the diaries, Dutch, actually German, because there's also some German figuring in the original. We have a Hebrew target text, this Hebrew results, the comic book or the graphic novel. And I will be presenting in English, which is sometimes a little bit difficult, so I will not be analyzing the textual parts in the comic book compared to the original text. I will limit myself to the visual examples, otherwise it will create some confusion, as I did not have the English comic book available to present here today. So we'll see how it goes. While I'll be using the theory of Jakobson about intersemiotic translation, I will also keep in mind the theory of Guillaume Toury, norms of the translator. I believe we'll also have a session about that later on. Which is especially important regarding the motivation that Avi Folman and David Polonsky gave when they wanted to translate this book. And that is to make the story of Anne Frank relevant for a screen generation. It already shows the importance of our time of visual media. And it will not come as a surprise that the comic book is actually preparation for an animated movie that will appear later this year and beginning of next year. So I will also try to study the movie and discuss a few aspects of it in this presentation. My presentation is interdisciplinary, so I will use theories from literary studies, but also from theater, music theory, literature. It's a very interdisciplinary approach. And what is also important is that it's still work in progress. I'm gathering the first observations and the results now. The TT, the target text or the translation into movie is not available yet, so I'm really at the beginning of the stage of this research, but I formulated the very general hypothesis that there is an impact on the act of storytelling because of new visual technologies used in translation of autobiographical stories such as Anne Frank. Okay, let's meet Anne Frank in the comic book. That's her over there in the middle. you can see, she is a simplistic representation of a realistic photograph of her from the archives. You can see that there is resemblance, but at the same time, she's still a comic figure. She's drawn in the style of also Hergé. It's called the ligne claire, the classic European comic form. Hergé is the author of Tintin, and you can see the similarities, the outline with the black line around. So that is Anne Frank. Here, contrary to the perspective in the book, in the diaries, original diaries, there's a first narrative perspective. Here we still have a first-person narrative narrator, but we can see Anne Frank, she's depicted. So it makes the perspective for the reader less intimate, because we see Anne Frank, we see her talk with the famous speech balloons, we see her think, we see the expressions on her face. We don't have to extract this anymore from the text. It's visual, it's right in front of us. And we also see her getting angry. So the visual reality of Anne Frank is actually limited, right? She's in this house hiding for years. So I think that what's at stake here when we analyze the comic book is not what she actually sees. They are her thoughts, her imagination, her opinions, her fantasy. The way she approaches reality as a young girl, that's what makes the diary so important and so relevant for still today. So when I will be speaking of what is at stake or the meaning of the text, I will refer largely to this part, the subjective experience of Anne Frank, which is much harder to make visual. And let's see how it's been done. A few examples from the comic book. This is the voiceover. Well, it's the obvious choice, actually. It's a strategy, translation strategy that comes from comic books, but also movies. We have a narrator speaking for Anne Frank. Here it's realized with the little rectangular square on top of the panel with the text. We have an icon of Anne Frank, we have the text representing her, and it enables the visual existence of her thoughts, but it still requires text. What do? We want to make a movie, and we do not want this text anymore, or a different kind of realization or translation. So this is the second strategy. It relies much more on visual. It's the metaphor. Just as in text, I think it's easily understood. We can see here, this is a metaphor of a piece where, a visual metaphor of a passage in the book where Anne Frank is explaining that she feels safe together with her family, even though outside of the house, the outside world of Amsterdam during the Nazi regime was dangerous. And she explained how they're hoping to escape through the darkness and the difficult, dangerous times to a better times. And I think that this is a very clear metaphor. I think the blue sky for everyone always signifies happiness, no worries, no troubles. And then we have the fire and the darkness all around her. So this is a very, very strong visual metaphor. Then we have the next example. In this part, originally in the source text, Anne Frank speaks of her fear of starvation. As we know, that one of the themes in the book is that the food is getting less and less, and the portions are getting smaller, and Anne Frank the whole family is fearing starvation. You would say that this kind of fear, which is in the back of her mind here, has been represented as a background of a foreground, which is the more objective area where Anne Frank is sitting at the dinner table with her family. So the illustrator here makes use of the fore and the background in order to create this subjective experience of Anne Frank. And I don't think we require so much text here anymore, because we have the visual. And by the way, this is a strategy used a lot in theater as well, where the background is very important. And it might be interesting to mention that Arie Folman is actually, at the moment, there's a play, his first play, premiering here in Kamari, the theater here in Tel Aviv, which is a translation of Hanoch Levin, one of his texts. So he's also active in the world of theater, and I think this is a very good example of that. Another strategy is the use of the caricature, the cartoon. When Anne Frank is being really critical about our patriarchal society, here it's been represented by women, the characteristics of women that are being exaggerated, making children, and repeated in order to realize a comic effect. this image is very strong and it shows immediately the criticism that she has on society. It does not necessarily require the text that is still there, but can be useful. So we've seen a few examples. Now a little bit of theory, because the functional cognitive linguist and semiotic viewpoint on this particular type of translation is that everything is a sign. Everything can be conveyed from one sign to the other. The word happy is a sign. This emoji, this smiling emoji is a sign. And this photograph of someone laughing is a sign. Signs can be communicated through all of our senses, visually, auditory, tactile, olfactory, or gustatory. And it follows that when we speak of intersemiotic translation, the relevant question is actually what is the strategy that they use? More into an iconic translation, or do they choose a realistic photograph? And this is what's at stake here also when you look at the comic book and at the movie. How real is the result going to be? I would like to use this pyramid. I don't know if anyone of you is familiar with it. It comes from the famous book of Scott McCloud, Understanding Comics. He's kind of a pioneer in the world of analyzing comics. In this book, he states that all comics have their place on this triangle between the picture plane, reality, and language. The picture plane is very abstract. It is pictures that do not have a meaning anymore, drawings, icons, pictures. Reality are signs that have a lot of realistic details in them. So for example, comics that have a lot of details, a lot of shades, that feel more realistic, look more like a photograph. These belong on that side of the triangle. And then there's the side with the emoji, and outside of the pyramid, the word face. Now what language and icons here have in common is that they both depend on agreed upon conventions about how we should interpret these signs. It's a complex plane, and it takes a while to get used to exactly what it means by that, because we're so used in our world to see mixed photographs, pictures, icons, words. So it really takes some time to master this pyramid and to understand exactly what he wants to say with it. But basically we forget that this smiley face here is an icon, because we use it on our phone with the emojis and everything, but we forget that it's just an icon. It doesn't actually look so much like a face, but it's something that we started to get used over time after time. And language has already been argued by de Saussure, a famous linguist, that there is no relationship between the form of a word and what it's referring to. So that is already, that goes as well for this triangle. So let's get back to Anne. Anne is a cartoon figure, and just like Hergé, she is located more on the language side of the triangle. Language is actually quite a confusing word here in this triangle. In other pages of the book, he uses the word meaning, which is actually more clear. So she's on that side of the pyramid. She's not completely to that side though, because I think that what's so amazing is that the hair of Anne Frank is actually being kept in order to make it realistic, in order to refer specifically to Anne Frank, which makes it go back a bit towards the left side of the pyramid, realistic. Nonetheless, it's still more of an icon that belongs on that side. What is important is, if you want to know what side of the triangle it is, it's like ask yourself the question, somebody who's never heard of Anne Frank, who is not aware with her, who doesn't know pictures or the book, what would they see when they see this girl? They wouldn't necessarily know that it's someone famous, right? So it has a more general function in that sense. Then we have this meme over there that is actually going viral a lot when there's adaptations made, film adaptations generally. It's to show how awkward it can be to transfer a comic to animate it, and then back to a realistic adaptation into film. Because reality is really the barrier here. Reality has so much space for error when you translate something to a realistic scene. There can be much more awkward, more explicit things. Over here we see that shape of the guy's head, like who knows what it means, who knows what it's referring to. And this is actually something that in comic you can just leave out, the background, the fact that there's a guy standing with a picture in the background. In a comic you just make it a white background or a blue background and it's solved. This is something you cannot do in reality. So that is also has a lot of impact on this translation. So I think the message here is that the strategy in comics can vary from more realistic towards realistic translation to a more meaningful, iconic translation. And to illustrate this, I have this example. This example from the diary includes this shape. I think they're called motion action lines, but I'm not exactly sure. This shape is not real. It is not there, even not in the world of the comics. It is there to show the reader an aspect of movement that is not there. It could not be there otherwise if it's not included in the comics. It was established in the text by the narration, but otherwise it wouldn't be there. So the motion action lines and the image representing the movements described by the narrator enables the visual existence of movement and does not really anymore require any text to explain the character. We instantly understand that there is a clash or accident happening here. Now, an example of the opposite is the use of color in the graphic novel. The use of color is actually surprisingly realistic. They use a lot of kind of like vintage feel colors. I, for example, recognize this yellowish background in the house from my grandmother's house in the Netherlands when I was young. These are actually colors that you would find in interiors in Holland, and the cans, the advertisements on the cans. So here color plays a realistic role in a way. It refers, it's almost like a cultural reference point to the era in which the comic book sets place. It can replace most of the text, not obviously everything. When there's dates in the diary, this is still necessary to convey. Another example of color which I find very strong, which is more iconic, is when Anne Frank is afraid. This is an example of she's laying in bed, she is scared, and the color used is dark. The color used is sober, and when she takes this tiny little pink pill, which is a calming pill to make her feel more relaxed and to make her sleep well, her world turns into bright, colorful colors. I think it's amazingly done. This is the kind of colors that normally a child would fantasize and see if it were not for the war and the situation she is in. So color representing the moods, representing the mood of the narrator. It enables the visual existence of moods and thoughts, and I don't think any text is anymore required here. It's a very strong visual message. Here we have an interesting example of color representing sound. Now sound is a typical kind of experience that you cannot have in a book or in a comic book. You can have it in a movie though, I'll mention it a bit later. But here, color is taking over and playing the role of sound. You can see that we speak here of the siren, and the siren has been represented by yellow and orange, bright yellow and orange colors. Same goes for the smell. Anne Frank at some point describes it kind of in a funny way that there's a lack of food, and at some point everyone is forced to eat cans of beans, which obviously results in a smelly environment in the house. It's actually a very funny part, and it's been conveyed like this, with the use of these speech balloons that remind us maybe a little bit of smoke, but also it's a not realistic feature. It's comic language added to represent the dimension of smell in the comic book. Okay, this is actually a complicated example, a very interesting one though. There is a part in the book where Anne Frank says she writes stories. She writes in her diary that she writes stories. It's almost like there's a meta layer, a story within a story. In order to represent that in the comic book, what they did is there's a realistic or more realistic layer above in color that is the normal kind of symbiotic world in which the comic book takes place. And then they moved to describe her stories in black and white, in more simplistic forms. The panels are more structured, more regularly, simplistically structured. And the reader, in a way, moves from one symbiotic world into the other. And I think this is actually a strategy that's really interesting and it's typical for Avi Folman. I'll get back to that later. And it's an interesting way of visualizing basically the difference between reality, between story, between fantasy. I think it's very successful. Okay, so far we've explored the language of the comic book, the visual dimension. I hope I showed you that the visual dimension does not necessarily mean realistic. It can be realistic, it can also be less realistic. And what I'd like to do in the last 10 minutes of this presentation is to broaden the field even a bit more. We can discuss a little bit about this if you like to, because I will be largely discussing here other forms of translation that are even less, I would say, no, never mind. If each medium has its own rules about which signs can be conveyed in this world, then I would like to argue that these rules are now being challenged more and more. I will explain this a little bit. This is a painting of Vincent van Gogh. And 2 years ago, I believe, a movie came out called Loving Vincent, and it's a movie in which the paintings come to life. They move. Through animation, it becomes actually a moving painting. This is one of the examples of classic painting sign becoming something else, something more visual, including the experience of movement. And this is not the only example. Cinemas now have the 4D experience in which you watch a movie but you have a seat that is moving and jumping. You have fans that spray water and wind on to make the experience more real. Sometimes even use the smell. So imagine that for a movie with Anne Frank, with the previous slides we saw. You could realize this as an experience. So I've discussed briefly sound and smell, but there's more senses that need to be conveyed. One of them is touch, and touch is, in this example, quite important. It's the scene in which Anne Frank kisses, for the first time, the boy that she's in love with in the house. It's the son of the other family that is hiding with them in the house. And here the strategy is reminds us almost of film. The intervals between the panels get less and less, get smaller, and we experience a feeling of slow motion, which adds to the importance of this event. Running a little out of time. Then there's this one, which actually, for me, was a source of excitement when I saw this panel, because this panel is the only panel in the comic book through which we experience, we see through the eyes of Anna. As you can see, her mother and father are pictured a bit blurry. And this is because at some point in the book she realizes, at some point in her life, I mean, she realizes that she needs glasses because her sight is getting less as well, and she needs to have glasses. And we experience this as a reader through her eyes. Obviously, it enables the visual existence of the first-person narrative in the most realistic moments of the story. We do not see through her eyes when she fantasizes, or do. That is something that we could definitely discuss, but I think that there's nothing more autobiographical than this, the feeling of seeing through her eyes directly. It reminds me of something else that I wanted to quickly touch on in this presentation, which is virtual reality. I don't know if any one of you here is familiar with the technology virtual reality. It's when you combine the human senses with artificial elements. Two different viewpoints are being combined together into the goggles, glasses through which you then experience a sense of depth. And you might get a little bit dizzy in the beginning, but once you get used to it, it's really realistic. It feels very, very strong and realistic. And since June 2018, the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam can be visited through virtual reality. So you can buy this tour online, a 25-minute tour, and experience it. And this is not, the virtual reality tour is not, of Anne Frank is not an isolated phenomenon. It happens worldwide for everything. We have also now a Van Gogh experience in virtual reality here in Israel. I don't know if anyone has been, the exhibition in virtual reality in Herzliya. So you can see that it's a lot of money and a lot of financing is put into this field where we have more immersive experiences of art or of stories. So this is, I would say, kind of like a trend. Will we be able one day to experience the Anne Frank house in virtual reality, complete with shaking seats when there is bombing happening and with smell effects that are being, that is a question. Of course, if we will have a realistic virtual reality experience of Anne Frank, there will be some autobiographic parts of the subjective experience of Anne Frank will have to be abandoned. It's almost like we need to choose, like with the pyramid, either realistic, no space for icons and text, or a lot of emphasis on icons and text that are less realistic, and we need to give up on the realistic feeling of it. And each target text has their own norms towards the relevance of these signs. Yeah. Yeah. So this example, as we've seen already, the graphic novel still strongly leans on the support of the text. There's a lot of text in the novel. In this part, Anne Frank is describing a feeling of guilt, that she still feels happy, even though many of her Jewish friends are being deported to the Nazi camps. She has a real discussion with her own conscience about life. And I think that it's a very good choice. I mean, I do not want to speak in terms of good and bad translation, but I think that the subjective role is definitely being kept in this example because the text is still referring there next to the icon of Anne Frank as well. Yes, so what would happen in a movie, for example, when there will not be text? I think that there will always have to be some sort of non-diegetic element, a sort of narrating function also in the movie. And I wanted to discuss this briefly, but I don't think I have enough time, which is in many cases soundtrack. Soundtrack in a movie plays the role of the narrative sometimes because it adds lyrics, it adds feelings, it adds music, melodies, instruments, and it's a different semiotic world that is also being added into the result. This example is an example for an image of a description that Anne Frank wrote in her book. But this is actually a description of something that she has not really seen, because it's based on something that she has heard. As we can see down below, it says, the original text, this is the only place where I had to look at the original text, it says, the spectators were outrageous about such a cowardly act of crashing a plane. The spectators implying that she wasn't actually there. So this picture is very realistic. First of all, it's a two-page panel, which is very rare in the comic book. It happens only, I think, on 3 occasions. So it takes a lot of space in the comic book. We see the bullets bouncing around. We see the motion X lines of the gun. The whole scene has a very strong feeling of objectivity, of presence, of almost like a testimony moment where things come over you and you're there. But of course, Anne Frank was, like I said, did not really see this. So what then is the purpose of this movie? Some translators tend to be more explicit, tend to include more of these kind of images in the comic book. But it is this tiny shift from reality, story, that I think is very relevant when we look at visual translation, because before you know it, this has established itself as an objective reality which she has seen, which was not the case. I prepared a little bit more about Waltz with Bashir, the famous movie by Avi Folman, to show in which way he plays with these semiotic worlds, because it happens in his other works as well, and I think it's kind of an indication of what we might expect in the movie. But I don't think I'll have time, but you can see that in the end of the movie he combines animation with realistic photo shooting of the Sabra and Shatila massacre, for who is familiar with that movie. And it also contains a message about the reality, memory, trauma, and how can you visualize these type of events. And I think it also will be relevant in the movie. So this is the movie poster for the movie that will come out. It basically will start at the point where the narrative of Anne Frank's diary ends. So it will cover the 7 months between the moment that they were discovered by the Nazis until the moment of her death. And that is a big challenge because nobody actually knows what happens in that period of time. I didn't know that the movie was going to be about this when I started the research project. But the solution that they found is to have Kitty, imaginary friend to which Anna writes in her diary, let her be the narrator. She will be the one waking up in modern day Europe, today modern day Europe. She will wake up, get to the Anne Frank house, steal the diary of Anne Frank, and go on a search to find Anne Frank's legacy, to find the memories of her, and that will actually be the topic of the movie. So I said the setting will be modern. The animated movie will be two-dimensional with stop-motion background, and the colors that will be used is actually interesting. There was a paragraph announcing that already. Are monochromatic colors. So Kitty, the storyteller, will escape out of this world that we described of vintage colors, realistic in a way colors, to go into this monochromatic world of Europe today. Monochromatic colors are used a lot today in design because it's different shades and light and dark of the same color that create a sort of coherent effect. It lingers longer in the thoughts, and yeah, we can already see here that the use of realistic colors perhaps had a function after all, to have contrast with this color use that will be used in the movie. So again, there's there's an interaction between the semiotic worlds, and I think that's really what interests me. If we follow the narration perspective along its path in translation, we started with the first-person narrative of Anne Frank in the book. We then moved towards a perspective that is still first-person, that is less intimate when we see Anne Frank actually moving in the comic book. And when we see that the illustrators had a bit of difficulty with finding the right perspective, including sometimes moments that were just heard, that Anne Frank just heard of by other people. And sometimes we look directly through her eyes. So they're struggling a little bit with perspective. And in the movie, Kitty, who was basically just a passive listener, the person that Anne Frank writes to, will become the storyteller, and she will get a much more active role in the movie. So what will be the implications of this? Of course, I cannot tell a lot yet about the movie. I didn't know many of what I just explained. When I started the research project, it will be interesting to have a look at this translation. But I hope that with the examples that I showed you, I can already show you that the impact from the text to a visual dimension